Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. As I'm on the Camperdown campus, I'd like to pay my respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. It is wonderful to be with you today for this fantastic workshop. I know everyone's a little bit anxious. With COVID, we're all wearing our masks, which is good to see it. I'll put my mask on as soon as I'm finished. We've got an online audience, and I like to think that they can hear me and they can see me. And I've got just a few things to say to set the scene, and that should be a really wonderful hour and a half, 2 hours, as we explore a really important topic. This is a nanotechnology innovation workshop sponsored by Sydney Nano, and I thought what I would do is to set the scene, give a brief perspective to really motivate the conversation today. You'll see on the slides that there are some barcodes you can take a photo of, and that will take you to various websites and how to connect with us on this topic and more generally. The University of Sydney Nano Institute is one of the university's flagship multidisciplinary institutes. We are a relatively new institute headquartered in the Sydney Nanoscience Hub, which ironically is not an exemplar of a net zero emission building. Important point of this slide is that we are truly multidisciplinary and have engaged across the broader university in areas of global national importance. I'll say more about that. And simply speaking, our research is organised, anchored in nanotechnology, but organised in 4 quadrants: the life sciences, nanomedicine, smart materials, which plays an important role in this conversation, sustainability, energy diversity, and quantum. And we operate in a global environment. Important to understand the global context. Last year, we saw a tipping point with respect to climate change recognition. We align well with UN sustainability goals. They have always been there at the front of Sydney Nano's strategy. At a national, at a New South Wales level, we are also seeing somewhat of a tipping point in terms of commitment to net zero initiatives, a stronger emphasis on national resilience and sovereign capability, and a state government that has formulated a 20-year R&D roadmap, which indeed is very relevant, aligned to many of the conversations we'll be having in this session. And at a university level, as well as having new leadership, we have an ongoing commitment to impact, and that impact, that translation, that engagement with the community is more important than ever. But we have a renewed enthusiasm and commitment to net zero emission. The Faculty of Engineering has initiated a whole of university conversation and strategy, and the university itself is investing in sustainability. At the same time, the university continues to invest in its own infrastructure. And that begs the question of whether its own infrastructure is going to be net zero emission. And so in that context, of course, this audience is familiar with the simple fact that the built environment is a significant contributor to global CO2 emissions, and you're going to hear more from Jeff and others in the session today. 37% of global CO2 emissions can be associated with both embodied and operational aspects of the building industry. Significant. Our hypothesis is that nano-enabled smart solutions are key to enabling sustainability in net zero buildings, and you'll hear more about that from Sydney Nano researchers in the session this afternoon. So Sydney Nano has started a conversation that is around and about reimagining buildings. The Smart Sustainable Building Network is integrating technology, nanotechnology in particular, and IoT to provide solutions to the issues of inefficiency in building construction and use. And of course, that can be broken down in terms of design, construction and operation, and that cascades to a number of benefits that you'll hear about. And I note the time, so I will wrap up and move to the speaker very soon. Today, you're going to hear from a number of my colleagues across the university exemplifying leading edge research being undertaken here at the University of Sydney and various faculties and schools as part of the Smart Sustainable Building Network. And I look forward to those presentations. And finally, just to end my introduction, to be very clear in terms of the purpose of this workshop, on the one hand, to introduce the Smart Sustainable Building Network and its core research capabilities to partners, to stakeholders, to build engagement with stakeholders in the built environment, and in particular to crystallise research collaboration opportunities to contribute to net zero emission buildings. So in this session today, you will hear 2 keynote presentations. I will keep them on time. There will not be a Q&A at the end of those presentations. There will then be 4 very short presentations from Sydney Nano researchers, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A, depending on the schedule. And then we'll have a panel discussion. And in the panel discussion, we've got thought leaders, and we'll be asking them and having a conversation about, indeed, the future of net zero buildings. This has been filmed. We have a remote audience. I'll be facilitating Q&A through the pad device. And on that note, I will now, I'm very pleased to introduce the first keynote speaker, Jeff Oatman from Green Building Council of Australia. We've had good engagement with Jeff this year, and he's had good engagement with the University of Sydney and the academic sector for many years. Jeff is at home recovering from COVID, so we wish him all the best. And we're delighted that he could join us remotely. I won't be introducing people because the bios are actually online, and we're going to keep this to very, very compact. So I look to Moen now to transition the slide to Jeff. And I'll put my mask back on. And Jeff, I'm going to give you a bit of a kick in 10 minutes. That's okay, and we'll wrap up on time. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. As with anything, after 2 years in COVID, we're still adjusting to this. About 5 minutes ago, I could share my slides very easily. And now suddenly I don't have access to share my slides. So unless, oh, here we go. IT, the most thankless job. Only get called in to help out when there's a problem. Look at that. And magically, it's all coming together. Okay. Off to the races. Thanks very much, Ben. It's really great to be a part of this, and I want to thank you for the invite and putting this together. This is a very interesting time for all of us and the work that we're doing. I've been with the Green Building Council for a little while now, and the focus on net zero has changed so dramatically over the past 3 years. We've seen huge shifts in the understanding, the perception, the awareness, and the interest to move the dial forward on this one. So it's really great to be a part of this. I'm taking a page out of Ben's book. I will just get cracking and move right through it. For those of you who aren't familiar with who the Green Building Council of Australia is, I'm sure some of you are. We're a not-for-profit, we're a member-based organization. We're very proud to have Sydney University as one of our longest-term members. As part of the work that we do, we're 20 years old this year, so we've been around for a little while. Most people know us from the work that we do around Green Star. So Green Star is this holistic rating system that looks after sustainability for the property sector for both new buildings, existing building operations, fit outs, master plan communities. And last year we launched a rating tool for homes, focusing specifically on volume home builders. And a big part of the work that we do and what's really driving us is to lead the sustainable transformation of the built environment. So that's been our mission for quite some time. And we're basically trying to set what a best practice benchmark is and move it forward. And we work with industry participants. So I look after membership. We've got 650 different member organizations across the property spectrum, about 10% are government. And as we've been marching away alongside with our members to try to lead to more sustainable outcomes, we've had a lot of really great feedback and support from our industry to push us forward. So as part of leading the sustainable transformation of the built environment, there's a number of very big questions that we tend to have to ask ourselves. And particularly when we're talking about net zero, there's questions like, why does the built environment need to be net zero in operations? Why is that important? Why we should be focusing on this? How can we agree on what net zero means, which is another very big question? What are the conditions where we can make change for the National Construction Code so we can really move the dial at scale? And how can we create a trajectory for change? So a lot of very big thinking questions that we have and we have to work through. And part of what I'll talk about today is how we're trying to lead the sustainable transformation of the built environment around net zero. So One of the really big moments, I think, that in my 10 years at the GBCA that I noticed was coming off the back of Paris and COP21. And there was, I think at that point, there's been a number of different things that have happened over the past 20 years in our industry, but that was a very big one. And it really defined a line in the sand where we were seeing at an international level, and Ben talked about how we don't work nationally anymore. It's all very international. We realized very quickly there's a very big piece of work at an international level to how we get to net zero. And with Paris and COP21 and the number of countries around the world, including Australia, signing up to it, we found ourselves saying, well, what does this mean for the property sector? And what is the role of the Green Building Council in working with our industry and pushing the dial forward around how we get to a net zero trajectory? So shortly after Paris, we sat down and we worked with a number of people in industry, and we wrote up what we call the climate positive roadmap for the built environment. And the idea was, it was basically drawing a line in the sand is, if we're here today and then we've got 2030, 2040, 2050, we have to be net zero. What are the key changes that are going to happen across the built environment, the property sector, to get us there? So we put out our climate positive roadmap for the built environment. And the idea was this was meant to be a kind of a primer for where things are going, to really help us set the trajectory for where we're taking, whether it's Green Star, whether it's our policy work, whether it's our training or anything else, to help us get to that net zero trajectory. We've subsequently, and again, our climate positive roadmap is available on the website. You can Google this and you can download it for free, and I encourage you to. We've also put a couple of other subsequent papers on this that really goes into the granular detail, both around our climate positive buildings and our net zero emissions, also climate positive pathway for existing buildings and existing building operations, and as well for master plan precincts. So that's all out there, and I encourage you to have a look. But at a high level, we took a look at this and said, well, if we're going to set and define the net zero trajectory, effectively, we're saying every new building in Australia is going to have to be net zero by 2030. So that's new construction, effectively from January 1st, 2030. Everything that's completed from that point onwards is going to have to be net zero net zero going forward. And then by 2050, everything that currently exists, which is the much bigger piece of the pie, will have to be net zero by 2050. So by lining those two markers in the sand, we sort of worked backwards and said, okay, what has to happen? And for those of you who are familiar with Green Star, we have the rating system that looks at 4, 5, and 6-star rated buildings for new construction, and then for everything else, it starts at from 1 to 6. But we effectively said, well, if we draw that line from from 2021, effectively all new 6-star buildings that are registered are going to have to be net zero, and then we're going to have to subsequently tighten the ratchet so that as we get a couple of years from now, we'll have to go 5-star will have to be net zero by 2023, and then a 4-star by 2026 will have to be net zero. And the idea behind this, or the reason behind this, is that assuming a building is registered from January 2026, the couple of years it's going to take for it to be designed and built, that by January 2030, January 1st, that building is going to be complete, or most likely to be complete. It'll come out of the ground and be net zero. So it's a very big piece of work that we put in place, and we've been spending a lot of time mapping out what that looks like. And obviously the next big question is, okay, well, how do we define this problem? What is a net zero building, and how do we define that? So in simplest terms, we define a net zero building as one that's built with lower upfront emissions, and Hudson's probably going to get stuck into this quite a bit of detail, so I won't cover too much of that. One that's designed to be highly efficient. Let's try to get the load and the demand down. Fossil fuel free and powered by renewables. And then finally, offset with nature. And the little yellow bars underneath there are specific credits within Green Star that have been designed to achieve that. And effectively, this is what we're looking at for new construction. Now, the existing buildings that are already in operation that have been built ages ago, what about those? Well, we have an additional requirement for those, is that there's a partnership for success, that you're specifically speaking with your tenants and working with them to get the tenant energy sources down. And we put a credit around other tenant emissions to focus on that one. If we look at this a little bit more graphically, if you see on the left-hand side, we've got our standard building with the emissions profile of what typically comes out of the ground today. And if we start chipping away at this bit by bit by bit, we can see we can get the emissions smaller and smaller and smaller. And our thinking, and the way our strategy is around this, is to try to design it in a way such that it encourages the progressive reduction of emissions. So if we look at fossil fuel and we live with natural gas from buildings, suddenly that becomes a little bit smaller. If we design it to be highly efficient and the demand requirements drop down, it gets subsequently smaller. Of course, powered by renewables and 100% renewable resources, it's even smaller. And then last but not least, looking at that lower embodied upfront carbon, it gets very small. And then last but not least, or finally last but not least, is offsetting with nature. So to be clear, there's not a requirement that is not allowed to be able to offset everything in the front and write a check for it. We don't want this. We want to go back to basics and streamline this going forward. So I mentioned that coming out of the ground, a 4, 5, and a 6-star right now. From 2026, we'll have what we call our climate positive pathway. From 2026, if you're a 4-star registered building, but then 2023 to get a 5-star, you'll have to be climate positive. And then everything that registers from right now that's going for a 6-star will have to be climate positive immediately. So we're sending the message to the market that things are definitely changing with Green Star, and the requirements aren't turning back. And if we look at this the other way around, part of the reason for this is to try to set something up for 2030. And this is what we've been doing with the Green Building Council, with other organizations like ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, which is a member organization of other member peak bodies, that we work, and we go to Canberra and we try to change the National Construction Code, and we try to change policy to influence this to net zero. And as a result, if we can start demonstrating that there are changes that can be made through the way that buildings are designed, built, and operated, it becomes much easier to say, let's talk about a net zero National Construction Code for 2030. When we look at existing buildings, is a similar question. What do we do about all the existing stuff? And that's maybe, the sort of diamond, the key jewel on the crown here. If we can get that right, what does that look like? So for us, we've got from 1 to 6-star ratings for the new existing buildings. And the idea behind here is progressively the screws get tighter and tighter and tighter. And we're moving from a carbon neutral, which is effectively net zero, but you can have gas that can be offset, to climate positive, which means no gas and no offsetting in that respect required. You have to be off gas completely. And you can see as we go closer to 2040 that those requirements get tighter. And we're still working through the exact details on what year, what lever is going to be pulled, but you get an indicative idea of where the trajectory is going for that. We've also been working with a number of leaders in industry. Some people say, well, that's really great, but how do you actually ensure that this is going to happen, and who's driving this? This is an example of one of the global leadership programs that we're working on through the World Green Building Council. And effectively, it challenges organizations, subnational governments to get to net zero for the assets that you own, occupy, or have control of by 2030. So it's very ambitious. And you can see these are the list of the Australian signatories that have signed up. There's about 150 global signatories that have signed up. Australia is definitely pushing way above its weight, as it typically does. But these are a list of the organizations that have said, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this by 2030 at the latest. And many of these organizations have already started moving that much, much sooner. GPT is probably the best example. Their wholesale office fund went net zero back in 2020. So they're way ahead of the game, and we're seeing more signatories sign up. Separate to this, we've also had people come to us and say, well, how do we work with industry to provide resources and support them? One of the things that we did was put together a practical guide to electrification for new buildings. We also have another practical guide for existing buildings that's on its way out. And these are some of the things that our industry they need and the requirements. So we're working with them to support this. And we expect that we're going to hear more about this, and there's going to be more organizations jumping on board to try to align with this net zero trajectory. So I think I'm probably within my 10 minutes. Hopefully I haven't spoken too fast, but I will stop there and I will pass control back to you, Ben. Thank you very much, everyone.
Lots of applause. No, Jeff, that was brilliant. I think perfectly on time. And we will come back because we have a panel discussion. I think that will be the opportunity to really dive in and unpack some of what you've said. I'm now very pleased to introduce Hudson Worsley, who is going to speak from the MECLA Alliance. I look forward to your presentation, Hudson. I'll ask you to introduce yourself, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to Sydney Nano for having MECLA in the room. So my name is Hudson Worsley from MECLA. MECLA is the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. I think my slides should be... Okay, here we go. So, thank you for having me. We're an industry alliance, and I'll explain how we came about. My little business is Precinct. We're a sustainability consultancy, and we sublease an office inside WWF just down in Ultimo. That means we are surrounded by the pandas, some really good thinkers around environmental action, advocacy, and so on. Several years ago, a colleague of mine, Ben Waters, who specialises in energy, spoke with the pandas, spoke with WWF about the need to bring the American model of corporate power purchasing agreements to Australia. And the Renewable Energy Buyers Forum was set up, and that has morphed into the Business Renewable Centre Australia, which has been a model in collaboration with the Rocky Mountains Institute in the US. That was a market intervention. As market players, we saw there was a need for information, for participation, supply and demand coming together to enable the uptake of renewable energy. The reason I'm saying all of that is that as that became established, we started to think, well, what's next? And literally over the water cooler, the next conversation was, well, embodied carbon's the next thing. It's a big ticket item. And as Jeff pointed out, 10, 15, 20 years of the Green Building Council and other related entities have been pursuing operational efficiency and operational carbon. Embodied carbon is now here. So the purpose of MECLA is to get the construction, infrastructure and big construction sectors onto a trajectory in alignment with the Paris Agreement. In doing that, we recognise that circular economy is crucial, that reuse of buildings rather than single use and short-term use is a big part of this, built for disassembly, better design, and so on. But we also recognise the intense complexity and the very fragmented nature of the building and construction sectors. I'll show a systems diagram in a moment, which really speaks to that point. Now, what are we doing? How do we do it? These key points really set out what MECLA wants to do. We want to demonstrate demand. We did some foundation research with seed funding from New South Wales government and spoke to 30 odd industry participants from research, procurement, government, design, head contractors. And we just found a sequence of, or a series, no sequence, multiple disconnections. We spoke to Rio Tinto about, hey, you guys are doing a lot in aluminium. What about recycled aluminium or green aluminium? Oh, our consultants tell us that there's no market for that. Then we spoke to Lend-Lease and said, hey, where do you guys get green aluminium? Oh, we can't get it. Nobody's interested. The market doesn't seem to think we want it. Okay, so there's a perfect example of market failure. And essentially, this is a market intervention during the very nascent period of market formation around low embodied and zero carbon construction materials. So demonstrating the demand is a primary objective. Defining what best practice means. As Jeff pointed out quite rightly, what is net zero? What does it mean? How do you get there? And how is it measured? Many of you will have heard of EPDs, environmental product disclosure statements. That's a bottom-up approach. But then there are input-output models that have a top-down assessment of how much carbon is in the cement here, the steel there, and so on. And they don't necessarily meet in the middle. So that's challenging. We want to share knowledge. There are many myths about new materials and an understandable but very present conservatism at the application end of materials design and engineering. We need to overcome some of those myths by pointing out what's been done already, what can be done, what's being done in other jurisdictions, so that we don't need conventional sequential change. We can rapidly move together. We want to develop a common language. In a quick search early on, we found that carbon positive and carbon negative in different sentences in different publications meant exactly the same thing. Well, you don't just have to be interested in grammar or science. That just doesn't make sense. So we wanted to address that. We want to help with transition risks. It's a change for business is a big risk, and change for construction that is often working with very small margins. Anything that delays a project costs time. Anything that costs time can blow out debt, can blow out loans, and can kill a contractor. So we have to help manage those risks by providing permission, by observing leadership, by sharing knowledge, and providing stimulation for new materials. And then we need to foster the engagement around the different materials, and I'll show that in a moment. How do we do these? We've established working groups. So across MECLA, I'll show our membership page in a moment, but we have the working group on demand, and that's come with head contractors coming together, for instance, Len Lee, Slang O'Rourke, John Holland, coming together to say, okay, how do we stimulate demand so that the suppliers know if Wholesome has a cement that is lower embodied carbon, how do they know that we'll buy it, and therefore they can invest in capacity to provide it at scale that then makes sense for us to buy it. Whoops. Okay. We've got a working group on the evaluation framework that I mentioned, another working group on language, and we're about to launch our dictionary of embodied carbon so that there is common language understood. Our website has references to all of these links. And formed around full transparency, full disclosure. We are emphatically pre-competition. So to have steelmakers in the room together, to have cement companies in the room together, or to have head contractors in the room, virtual or physical, we have to establish that there's no collusion, there's no anti-competitive behaviours, but in the recognition that we can't do this on our own, no one participant in the ecosystem can step forward on their own. And then our material working groups, steel, concrete and cement, aluminium, other materials, which is engineered timber, bitumen, ceramics, and so on, reformed plastics. And then building services. They came late to the party because several of I think it was Len Lease that pointed out to us, hey, there's huge embodied carbon in total in the systems that make our buildings work. They need a group of their own. So they've come together to get moving and to collaborate. When we started, we wanted 40 members from the ecosystem. Got over 120 now, which is an embarrassment. It's wonderful how we manage that. That's the tricky bit. But essentially, you'll see brand names here from the big end of town, from suppliers, the Institute of Architects. We have Engineers Australia, quantity surveyors, chartered surveyors, customers, suppliers, government procurement, all parts of what I'm referring to as the ecosystem, because together we can move forward. As any one individual, it's just too risky. So this is our systems diagram. I've got a background in energy in the property sector, and so I stood at a whiteboard when we were doing our brainstorming and just drew out project concept, concept design, detailed design, out to market, and so on. But we realized with all the loops and arrows that I'm sure you're familiar with mind mapping and systems diagrams, that said, actually, this just isn't linear. And so the concept of the ecosystem was much more applicable than a value chain. We started to say, well, what are the materials that are involved? What are the barriers? What are the enablers? What are the pressure points that drive action? Who are the influencers? The Green Building Council gets a rap there because they are such a strong influence. Who are the decision makers and what are the enablers? And then to show you how we're intervening in the market, you don't have to look at all of the detail, but just trying to show here that our working groups are very targeted to specific barriers inside the ecosystem to show where can they act, where can they intervene, how can a case study to show that geopolymer cement was used in the Toowoomba taxiways for its new airport, how can that help with something that's going on in Western Sydney? Because if the New South Wales jurisdiction says, oh, it hasn't been done in New South Wales, but we can point out, well, just over the border it has been done, then hopefully that can accelerate change here. So to date, working with government around and head contractors around a pledge prerequisite. So that's looking at the UK model, which has said, if you want to sell to government, build big projects, your organisation needs to commit to a net zero pathway. That's tricky, but we're working on it. To measure and disclose, we're in close collaboration with the Neighbours program, which is looking at an embodied carbon component to its rating mechanisms. We've released discussion papers on existing standards, the functional units methodologies. That's the top-down, bottom-up piece that I mentioned. And that is really contested. The idea of, is it EPDs or is it input-output? Is it both? organisations, suppliers that have invested heavily in an EPD because they're expensive to have done, very thorough life cycle assessment based approach for many ESG, environments, social and governance aspects of a material, not just our focus on carbon. They believe that that's the way to go. Others who are looking at, say, a whole precinct, a whole Barangaroo or a whole Sydney University, they need more breadth of data rather than deep dive individual product data. And somewhere in between, I think, is where we need to meet. We've developed our website, again, all around sharing. We've done that in collaboration with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, close friends of MECLA. I mentioned our Dictionary of Carbon. We hold spotlight events, maybe a spotlight event on nanotechnology in the future, but spotlight events on steel. Where are they up to? Because it is really hard to decarbonise steel, particularly the way we make it in Australia with blast furnace. We've had spotlights on timber, on aluminium as well, and cement, concrete. The Cement and Concrete Group is setting up a performance-based specifications task force, because at the moment, a lot of, particularly government procurement, is very specific on a mix rather than on performance, what it needs to achieve. And that makes the change to geopolymers or to other offsets very difficult. So the industry coming together to work on that, and that's universities, suppliers, and customers as well. So yeah, look, the whole idea of MECLA is to do ourselves out of a job. We don't want to be around in 3 years. We want the market to be sufficiently mature with suppliers, with demand, that engineers know how to specify, architects know how to design, procurement professionals know what to ask for so that they're not inadvertently closing off the door to innovation. And then we'll get out of the way. But in the meantime, it's about bringing the conversation together so that suppliers have the confidence to invest in their innovation and their new materials, so that governments have the confidence to say, hey, industry, this is what we want. So that one of the strongest members is Lend-Lease. They've said absolute zero by 2040. No offsets, absolute. There's no way they can get there unless the whole industry moves with them. MECLA is there with industry to help make that happen. I can leave it there. Look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Right. So 2 fabulous keynotes, spot on, perfect timing, and we're actually ahead a minute. So I might just sit here in silence. No, what we'll do is we'll move on. We will have the opportunity for Q&A, as I said, so stay tuned. And now we move on to a really exciting second phase of the workshop. We're going to have 4. We had 5, but one of our colleagues has gone down with COVID, as you would expect right now. Very punchy presentations from scholars, from researchers, highlighting unique research, leading edge research at the University of Sydney. And what I love about this session, it really does exemplify the comprehensiveness of the University of Sydney's research and the multidisciplinary flavour to what Sydney Nano is promoting. So I'm really pleased to ask, we're going to have Arianna, and then we're just going to, I won't even segue, you'll just transition beautifully. You'll go from Arianna to Arunima to Alex to, sorry, I missed someone. No, Arianna to Ali, to Arunima, to Alex. It's like A, that's a bit spooky, isn't it? So with that, Arunima, I'll ask you to come to the stage and you have 5 minutes. And over to you.
Thank you, Ben, for inviting us to present. So I'm Arianna, and I'm here on behalf of the Building Efficiencies Smart Sustainable Building Cluster. So my co-chair, Yuan, and all the researchers that express interest in being part of this cluster. So we did not probably understood our duties, Ben, because we are not presenting our research, but rather give a flavor of what the cluster as a collective of researchers can do. So building efficiency cluster, what we do is tackle efficiency challenges associated with energy, cost, and time consumption for both building construction and operation, developing innovative nanomaterials and applying efficient design principles to create low carbon buildings. So as you may know, building efficiency may mean different things to different people. So the cluster actually is composed of a broad variety of different researchers coming from different schools and different faculties across the university. So we have people like myself from the School of Architecture, we have one from the Faculty of Engineering, but we also have people from chemistry and sciences. So with all these different expertise and leveraging all our experience, clearly what we can do is tackling building efficiencies from different perspectives. So the Smart Sustainable Building Network is quite new. So we launched the initiative at the beginning of the year. So as a cluster, we are at our infancy. And what we are trying to do in this moment is weaving all our research expertise together to create a cohesive narrative of what we can do. And what we realized soon is that all our research is built upon three major pillars and are, of course, environmental impacts, climate, and design. And what we do as a cluster is trying to find solutions for future-proofing the built environment, applying a cradle-to-grave approach, and trying to achieve resiliency to achieve resilient outcome. As dimension of research, what we do is really looking at multidimensional and multidisciplinary research. So we started looking at materials, so at the nanoscale, at the material scale, and we moved to components, so how these materials come together in a built environment or in a building, and then how the building as a system works with its climate and with the occupants, but also how all the buildings, when are together, can work together. And I think that this it's quite clear that as a cluster, we have expertise of our own, but we can't work in isolation. And that's probably also the strength of the Smart Sustainable Building Network, because we have different clusters focusing on different aspects of the built environment, but they can work together when needed. So to bridge the nanoscale to the city level. As approach, let's say, all our researches probably can be grouped into these three different parts of the design process, and these design for efficiency, so reduce what the resources that buildings use, build to contribute, so producing something, and that's also part of the efficiency of the building, but also managing whatever is produced or saved in a smart way. So we can't really just save energy or produce energy. We really need to understand how it is better managed inside the building. So what you can see here is part of the researches that we have inside the cluster itself. And one of the unique principle of our cluster is really using prototypes to understand what building efficiencies is. So we leverage the infrastructure of the university, like the City Manufacturing Hub, the DMAF Lab in the School of Architecture, or the newly Phoebe prototype in our School of Architecture, to prototype what we mean as efficiency and try to see what are the next steps. And we, as all clusters, try to have a sort of SWOT analysis, and what we realize that the strengths and the opportunities that we see are really in the network. So leveraging the singular expertise and experience of the different researchers and weaving together all of these into a sort of, as I would say, collaborative approach to building efficiencies. Thank you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate for this invite, and it's a great pleasure to be here and present to all of you about the cluster that I'm co-chairing with Professor Simon Fleming. So my presentation is very short. I think probably it doesn't get into 3 minutes even, but it's mainly focusing on our capabilities as part of sensors and automation cluster of Smart Sustainable Building Network in City Nano. So basically the objective of this cluster is to develop automated frameworks and advanced sensors for for buildings and structures to have more sustainable infrastructure, and also have and also achieve net zero target of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the technology that we look at is using advanced sensors and also AI enabled technologies to achieve net zero targets by 2050. So the sections of the buildings that we look at in this cluster are mainly building envelopes, and for example, like facades, roof, and windows. And as part of that, we look at the structural health monitoring, for example, of the buildings, and also developing fiber sensors for this purpose. Also, we look at the AI enabled monitoring techniques and automation for, again, for structural health monitoring. Also, we look at indoor environment and how these sensor cluster and these technology can improve the performance of HVAC system or reduce the carbon emission, or for example, looking at photonic sensors for reducing to achieve net zero. So the other aspect is looking at utility efficiency, like energies and the use of gas in buildings. So Sydney Nano, this framework, this cluster, and this initiative provides this platform for us to have a really collaborative environment between researchers and also industry. So to achieve the goals that we aiming for. This cluster has access to different researchers with different background from different schools and different faculties. Also, we have these capabilities in terms of our research centers and research facilities, such as Research and Prototype Foundry, RPF, and which we have unique facilities for production of fiber optics in the university. Also, we have access to Sydney Manufacturing Hub for example, additive manufacturing and also characterization and post-processing of metals, ceramics, and different types of materials. Also, ACMM for material characterization provides very good opportunity for us to achieve the aims of this cluster. As kind of projects that we've done so far, part of this cluster with industry, we had projects with which was supported recently by New South Wales Smart Sensing Network on fiber optics, and using that for structural health monitoring of bridges, and using digital twin and finite element modeling and digital twin of those bridges in collaboration with Transport for New South Wales. Another project we had was with Lion Gold Road, again, using these technologies, sensors for adaptive structural health monitoring. As part of automation, we also have machine vision and AI-enabled technologies for crack detection in, for example, reinforced concrete bridges, which was being done in collaboration with Transport for New South Wales, and also we are working with our Australian Road Research Board to develop techniques for crack detection and a smart automated structural health monitoring. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. So in my brief talk today, I'll talk about the circular construction supply chain and life cycle management cluster. In this cluster, the aim is to come up with transformative construction solutions that focus on circular economy principles and systems thinking approaches. In terms of the key research themes, we are looking at eco design, which is theme number 1, to achieve a net zero construction through a people-centric design, advanced manufacturing through advanced manufacturing technologies. Theme 3 is on reuse, and that is really focusing on material circularity. Theme 4 is on transition pathways to impact, which is about enabling circular business transitions. So the focus is really to move towards the circular economy, transitioning from linear to circular. There's also a theme of research in the cluster that is taking place on supply chain assessments, and that is about constructing these virtual laboratory platforms at different scales. There is one for Australia, globally, and for other countries as well. And that is really to look at embodied carbon, environmental, social, and economic impacts, and coming up with indicators for supply chain performance of construction materials. In terms of the team, the cluster is co-chaired by Professor Ali Abbas and myself. We have steering committee members, Professor Glenelle Proust from the Faculty of Engineering, Dr. Fabian Sack from the Faculty of Science, and Dr. Sam Kocher from the Faculty of Science. In terms of the broader team of researchers who have expressed interest in this cluster, we have from the business school, from engineering, different schools in engineering, Faculty of Science, and School of Architecture, Design, and Planning. And the capabilities that the cluster is focusing on, or the cluster offers, is on life cycle management. We have research taking place on circular design, footprinting. So it's very interdisciplinary cluster that spreads across faculties, across different schools, on circular construction materials, supply chain analysis, integrated sustainability analysis, focusing not just on carbon, but also other indicators to look at trade-offs. Advanced manufacturing, low emission technologies, so clean grid, for example. What is it really feasible to have a complete renewable energy grid for Australia, and what's needed, what's involved? Do we have the feedstocks? Looking at different energy technologies, circularity indicators, and circulytics. The Smart Sustainable Buildings Network, and this cluster in particular, is bringing together industry, government, and global organizations in joint collaborations. So we have MECLA here, we have UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we have in New South Wales Health. So interestingly, even though the focus today is on buildings and construction, but we have other sectors in the economy who are really recognizing that construction is in their supply chain. And if you have the health sector, of course, they have many buildings. If we look at the health system, then what is really the supply chain impact in terms of constructions, in terms of the buildings that they have? So the Western Sydney Local Health District is an interesting collaborator that we have, who's looking at their supply chain, specifically focused on construction and the impact of buildings. Then we have WWF, UNEP, New South Wales Circular, local government New South Wales, and other, so City of Sydney and other collaborators. So as I mentioned, the cluster on circular construction, supply chain, and lifecycle management is very interdisciplinary. We have a range of research themes, but on this slide, I'll really focus on two to give a brief snapshot on addressing supply chain impacts and the Waste Transformation Research Hub. So the Waste Transformation Research Hub is led by Professor Ali Abbas, and it really offers a whole systems thinking approach towards a circular economy. There are many substreams of research taking place in the Waste Transformation Research Hub, advanced 3D manufacturing, for example, Waste Atlas for Australia. So the snapshot here shows an interactive geospatial map, which has data on waste, different kinds of waste at LGA level. We have capability in assessing supply chain impacts, looking at environmental indicators, social indicators, and economics. So for example, these indicators can be linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you have biodiversity threats, an indicator for that can be linked to SDG 14 and 15 for greenhouse gas emissions, could be linked to SDG 13, poverty, SDG 1, and modern slavery is this new indicator that is really now, might have heard in the media as well. So we've come up with this new indicator as part of the cluster research that's taking place. And so these indicators on environmental, social, and economic sphere, and linking these to the UN Sustainable Development Goals within the Industrial Ecology Virtual Laboratory could be used for assessing supply chain impacts. And when I mean supply chain impacts, I'm looking at scope 3 impacts in addition to scope 1 and scope 2. This diagram that I have on the far right, my right, of the slide is on production layers. So really, in terms of assessing supply chain impacts, if we want to identify hotspots in the supply chain, in terms of our suppliers of suppliers, then where exactly are those hotspots? From a regional point of view, if we have international supply chains, from a sectoral point of view, or if the supply chains are local. So the capability that the cluster offers in terms of its research on supply chains and linking these to research that's taking place across the university, for example, the Waste Transformation Hub, and the work that we're doing with collaborators from Ali's group in linking the geospatial map with input-output analysis and supply chain assessments could really sort of offer, interesting insights towards net zero building. So these are just these 2 snapshots out of the many that I mentioned in terms of capabilities. Thank you.
Brilliant. We'll move on to the last. Alex Song from the Faculty of Engineering. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Ben. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to introduce you the indoor environment cluster in the Smart Sustainable Building Network. This is led by co-chair Richard, sitting over here, and me myself. So we are from different faculties, and it's a wonderful collaboration. So to motivate a little bit, here is the image I like to show on all of my talks. So we realize that the majority of this image of outdoors, outside of a building, but we realize that the majority of energy used by a building is in the indoor environment quality. And the majority of that is the thermal comfort in terms of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And also that includes air quality and lighting. And another number, just a rule of thumb, is 15%, about 15% of global energy consumption is in the air conditioning of buildings. So needless to say, it is important to understand how we quantify indoor environmental quality, how we relate that to the human comfort and human performance, and how do we design it better. So this is what we do. We look at alternative energy efficient strategies and schemes for thermal comfort and for human performance. We look at ventilation and air quality. We look at how to quantify the indoor environmental quality and how to relate that to the human performance. And the overall scheme is to design sustainable for net zero carbon initiative. So for the rest of the slides, I'm going to give you some quick examples and capabilities of what's going on in this cluster. So the first example is the Indoor Environmental Quality Lab that's led by Professor Richard Hadigheh, sitting over here. So the lab will I have a mouse? Yes. So the lab may look like a regular office space on the first glance, but behind the walls is where all the different sensors, different schemes are installed. We have different strategies for air conditioning, different mechanisms for moving air, and for chilling, for warming, and different sensors. So one typical example of a recent project carried out by Richard is the project for ventilation strategies for COVID safety. It's a study done for the school infrastructure in SW. So it basically look at how do we make sure that indoor environment is safe in classrooms, in conference rooms, with different ventilation schemes. So thank you. If you're interested, you can contact Richard for more information. And this is my research. What we did is we look at passive cooling and heating textiles. So the reason we did this is we look at if we can cool or warm the human body on a local level by the textiles themselves, instead of the AC, we can look at saving significant energy. And the way we do this, we use nanostructured textiles to control the thermal radiation from our body and to control the thermal radiation interaction with the environment. And this can cool or warm the human body entirely passively without energy input. And that can save significant energy in the air conditioning. And this works for both indoor and outdoors, winter and summer. And these textiles, we first initially developed them for the human body, but recently we're also looking at apply the same principle to other parts of the building, including the windows, the indoor surface, and the facades. So here's a quick image of the new textile that we developed. It's very thin. It looks like a shirt, white shirt, but compared to a sweater jumper, it looks very cold on the outside because it's trapping all the energy inside. And it's a passive heating textile. And it achieves 7 degrees of set point temperature saved in the air conditioning, and they save you about 70% of the AC energy. So another facility that's relevant to the indoor research is so-called the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, directed by Professor Ollie J. And here's an image of the beautiful climate chamber in the lab. Also directed by Ollie is the recently launched Heat and Health Research Incubator. And one of the research themes in the incubator is the built environment and health. So what this laboratory does is it can simulate all kinds of different, it takes all the past, past weather events, and it can simulate and predict the future weather events, and it can control a wide range of indoor conditions going to extremes and simulate different combinations of humidity, heat, and air quality, and look at the impact of this indoor environmental quality. Look at the impact of that on the physiological strain, and look at the how it influences our performance. So there are many researchers in Sydney that have identified that research is relevant and of interest to this cluster. And if you are interested in what we do, please contact us, and we look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. I want to just acknowledge my colleagues. That was lovely, really inspiring stuff. And we have 10 minutes. We're perfectly on time. So we now have an opportunity to ask the 4 speakers questions. We have a panel discussion to dive in more deeply in terms of the keynotes. My understanding is that I have an iPad which will allow me to take questions from the virtual audience, and there's a roaming microphone that will be distributed to allow, in a hopefully COVID-safe way, questions to be put to the speakers. And I think the idea is the speakers just stay where they are. There are no questions, but the floor is open to the real or the virtual audience. The questions to Arunima, Ali, Alex. I've got 4. So Arunima, Ali, Arianna, and Alex. Sorry, there was a pattern there that I wasn't struggling with. Do I have any questions? Gary.
Okay. Gary Cox from RPS and the university's Henry Halloran Trust. This is maybe a question for Jeff, if he's still with us. How much of the achievement of these 2030 and 2050 targets do you think depends on changing regulations?
It's a very good question. I think it definitely goes hand in hand. It's kind of a sticks and a carrot and tambourine approach. So we're probably partly trying to set a trajectory, and at least in the environment and the organizations that we typically work with, it's among those that are leading. They're pushing the envelope, and they're really striving. But that will get us so far, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And having regulation come into place will definitely help move things in. We'll probably have to help move things and force it along. Just as a quick anecdote, like the latest changes to the National Construction Code and the energy efficiency requirements around that, a big part of that came from us working with the Building Codes Board and showing them and demonstrating that there's a stack of Green Star projects that have actually met that requirement, and it can be done, and proving that what was thought was maybe impossible is possible. And it's industry pushing the envelope and giving the confidence, I suppose, for governments to put legislation in place that can allow for changes. So I think in a very long-winded way, it's very important. It'll have to happen. There's a whole sort of second tier and third tier below that where a lot of funny stuff happens. And I think unless we have strong regulation to enforce that, we're not going to see us getting to where we want to. And separate to that, when we speak to our colleagues, so as part of the Green Building Council, we're part of this broader global network of green building councils around the world. When we speak to our colleagues in Europe, a lot of them are saying that you can expect big legislative changes, probably not so much in this half of the decade, but in the second half of the decade, as we get closer to 2030, a lot of that stuff will happen. So we're finding that a lot of the organizations, like the ones that I showed on the slide there for the Advancing Net Zero program, a lot of them see that's happening. They're being pushed by their investors because they know it's coming. So they don't want to be caught flat-footed, and they're saying, let's jump on it now and get on with what we know is going to happen. Sorry, that's a very long-winded way to answer a fairly simple question.
Good one. Thank you, Jeff.
There you go.
Yes, Ron.
Thank you. Ron Johan, NSSN. Just wanted to ask, there was an article on the ABC News a few days ago about how poorly designed Australian residential premises were in terms of being a refrigerator in winter. I was just wondering, to what extent can these houses be retrofitted to make them more energy efficient? Thank you.
It's a good question. That was the type of question I was imagining the panel would want to unpack, and we've got an expert in the audience who might want to have a go at that question. Nicole, there's the microphone on its way. Oh, you feel free to go ahead.
So unmute me. Look, that's a question that involves both research evidence in terms of the capacity for retrofitting the stock, as well as a whole lot of economic changes that need to be rolled out to address retrofitting as well. So maybe people in Arianna's team on the architectural science side are better enabled to talk about the feasibility of retrofitting the 8 million odd homes in Australia that don't meet standards at the moment. But then there's the whole challenge around how you actually finance that that retrofit. I'd see that as one of the biggest challenges, actually.
Just following up that, Richard Hadigheh from Architecture, Design and Planning. We actually did that. Over a decade ago, Australia started insulating homes. And it became a political fiasco.
Yeah, well, did it?
Didn't, no. But I often look to California for sort of examples of ways of dealing with these sort of questions. And in California, energy efficiency is an alternative to building electricity capacity. So instead of building new power stations, they invest in energy efficiency. It's a more effective use of capital.
And is it fair to say that's a government top-down?
That's exactly right.
Right.
California.
So there's an obvious role for government here. So that's good discussion. We have a little bit of time for questions. We can pick up on this thread. We can pick up on this in the panel. We've got 25 minutes for the panel. I would like to ask Dr. Alex Song to tease out a bit more detail this passive cooling technology, which most people are not familiar with. It's fascinating. And as you hinted at, it provides a new paradigm for cooling without any electricity source. Begs the question, how much cooling is possible? Can you give us a rough idea what the state of the art is, and how far do you think that can go in terms of actually practically cooling buildings? Is it science fiction? Is it on the road? Are there commercialization potentials there?
Yes, thank you, Ben, for the question. Oops, sorry. So yeah, hello.
Yep.
Yeah, so very good question, very relevant. I've been asked that question a lot when I introduced this idea of passive cooling and heating. There are definitely laws in nature that we cannot violate. Second law of thermodynamics, we can cool body too much colder than the environment. But state of the art in terms of in the lab for the textile for the human body, for the cooling side, we can achieve compared to cotton compared to wool, these traditional textiles can achieve about 3 degrees Celsius of cooling. So that's and that's close to as the best that we can get in terms of the best we can have for cooling is to bare skin. If you're not wearing anything, it's the best strategy for cooling because nothing is blocking you. But then there are other questions related. Is the textile comfortable? Is it environmentally sustainable? Is it washable? Is it colorable? So all these questions are to be solved before it can hit the mass market. For the heating side, for the indoor environment, state of the art is about 7 degrees, as we just 7 degrees. Sorry, as we just mentioned for the heating side. But then again, it's also related to the question of is it comfortable? Is it washable and tumble dry? All that questions. In terms of building heating and cooling, for the building outer surfaces, roof and facades, state-of-the-art number is about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of cooling in the daytime. So nighttime is a different story. Daytime meaning under the direct sun, the surface of this building with this new, you can call it a film or a layer, can be colder than the bare concrete and other parts of the regular surface by 3 to 4 degrees. That's in the broad daylight. So for the cooling.
So in summary, you're optimistic that can play an important role in this whole deal?
I'm very optimistic because it's free in the sense that once it's fabricated, it does not require any energy input. You put it on.
It's built into the facade.
Yeah, and it's there forever, and it's providing cooling for you without cost nothing. Exactly, free AC. That's how to put it. Thank you.
We have a few more minutes. Our online audience has gone to sleep, it seems. But we're going to have a panel discussion, but any other questions aimed at the speakers?
This is just a general question. For the clusters, how do you want to approach collaboration with industry and how do you see the clusters growing and that sort of partnering or networking to happen?
Yeah, good question. I think the clusters and the network is a vehicle to engage externally. So whether it's with the clusters or with the network, I think what you've heard is that actually the power of this initiative is the comprehensiveness across the clusters so that the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. The university engages externally in many different ways, on large-scale initiatives, on highly collaborative initiatives with other universities, other institutions, other companies, and then more bilateral individual projects. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in exploring partnership to reach out to myself, any of the speakers today, and we'd love to have a conversation with any of the partners about how the University of Sydney can partner through the Smart Sustainable Building Network. The network is a vehicle for that collaboration and engagement. We believe that to address some of these global challenges, particularly net zero emissions, sustainability, needs a whole of university multidisciplinary approach. And what we've been able to achieve here is bring these outstanding scholars together to achieve the whole being much greater than the sum of the parts. So please reach out. Please, Marwan is here, works in Sydney Nano as a point of contact, and myself or any of the speakers that you heard from. Yes.
I'd actually put this to any of the, particularly the University of Sydney speakers, and that is, we know that building capacity in the industry is a really important goal or a barrier, however you want to look at it. So how have your respective curriculums changed in terms of your teaching, and or are you doing work with industry as well in terms of, I don't know, short courses? Is it what type of knowledge transfer is occurring both through your teaching programs, which are presumably cross-disciplinary, and also with industry?
Who wants to have a go? Arunima.
Thanks for your question. So I'll give an example of Masters of Sustainability, the course that I teach in. So we have a number of units in the Masters of Sustainability. In those units, we invite industry guest lecturers to come in and provide their insights to students on how they are. So my research is on supply chain assessments. So how they are sort of addressing the life cycle assessment initiatives or aspects in their organizations. So we had someone from Sydney Water, for example, come in and talk about some of the footprinting work that they've done. And that has led to some new collaborations as well, and WWF as well, for example. So that's one example that I'll quote sort of to say how we're sort of building this capacity in the industry, transferring knowledge of the new techniques that we're developing, and also hearing from industry in terms of what they would like to see coming out of academia to help them in addressing their missions and their goals.
Maybe I can also...
Yes, but I might just suggest, hold on to that question and hold on to the microphone. We might move to the panel discussion, and that means I'm going to ask Nicole, Hudson, Gillian. Oh, there you are, Gillian, right. Sorry. I know it's impossible. Gillian and Ali to come to the panel table, and in a COVID-safe way, we'll just continue this conversation. It'll be with Arianna, and then I've got a couple of questions that are coming through the virtual chat. So Anna, bear with us. We're going to get to your question. Thanks for that.
Oh, okay.
So what we might do, and it would be appropriate to me to ask that briefly, we go from right to left and ask each of you to introduce yourself. So Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole Gurrin. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning, and my specialty is really on planning and housing. And I also direct the Henry Halloran Trust here at the University of Sydney, which is a philanthropically funded cross-disciplinary research centre which is dedicated to really harnessing the multi-disciplinary expertise across the university to address urban and regional problems.
Thanks, Nicole. Ali.
Ali Abbas, I'm director of, and thanks for Arunima mentioning that, director of the Waste Transformation Research Hub at the School of Chemical Engineering. And I'm also a deputy director of Sydney Nano under the portfolio of innovation, industry, and commercialization.
Yeah, over to you, please.
So Hudson Worsley from MECLA as before. That's me.
Yes, and Gillian.
Hi. Yes, I'm on. Gillian Graham-Crowe. Hi, everyone. I joined the university back in April as the new Director of Sustainability for Sydney University. Brand new role. So I'm tasked with leading the rollout of the sustainability strategy to essentially support the university in meeting our targets and goals under that strategy. And hopefully I'll have a chance to talk to it a little bit during the discussion.
Great, and we've still got Jeff online. Jeff, I think you can just reintroduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm still here, and my name is Jeff Oatman. I'm with the Green Building Council of Australia.
Great. So we're going to go ahead with Arianna's question, and then I've got a few questions on the chat. Over to you, Arianna.
No, I wanted just to build upon what Arunima was saying on how we can build capacity in the industry for a more sustainable future, let's say. So, and I wanted just to say that is double-fold, because it's, yes, bringing industry in the class, but also trying to train our students to be better industry experts in the future. So I think that is always like this double conversation inwards and outwards.
Okay. Well, I've got a question through the chat, and it comes directly open to the panel. How do university researchers can assist in changing policies? Because it sounds like to address the grand challenge, government needs to be brought on board. Who wants to have a go? I think, Jeff, that's pointed at you, but maybe Jeff help that, and then we'll ask the rest of the panel.
Sure, I think it's a really good question, and I think there's a huge role for research to underpin policy change. So I think probably one of the areas that makes me that I would recommend right off the bat would be seeing how you can align with the private sector, with industry, to prove some of the concepts that they're trying to achieve. And there's this hand-in-hand approach where industry working with academia together to demonstrate that something can be achieved, and then that going together. It's not just an academic idea, or it's not just some industry idea. Together, it's working to achieve an outcome that can be much more powerful than doing it singularly. And I can see that what MECLA has done through the work that Hudson's been involved with is a great demonstration of that. Because when you do get a combination of industry and academia working together, suddenly you get a lot of attention and interest from government. So there's a huge opportunity there.
Well, I can see Hudson would love.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, because so my last corporate role was at Stockland, the integrated property company, and I was head of sustainability in the residential business there. And I love innovation. I actually changed the job description for my whole team so that innovation was in that description. But the business itself is very risk averse, as I mentioned before. Anything that can cause a delay costs money. And so, and I was often told, show me 3 times. Show me, I want to be a fast follower, Hudson. I don't want to be on the bleeding edge. I want to be on the leading edge. So the question is, how does research translate from bleeding to leading? And I think with government, it's the demonstration projects, and where there are leading industry players to provide the case studies, but then be generous with that knowledge, to share it as broadly as possible, so that we don't have to have a demonstration in Sydney, a demonstration in Melbourne, a demonstration in Queensland, in Brisbane. It's done once and shared broadly. All the sensors, all the smarts, all the write-up, all the analysis, and then share it, have government recognise that, stimulate it. And ultimately, we need to, if we can influence government procurement, it's not quite policy, but it's the application of policy, government procurement for the materials that we're talking about. That to me is one of the biggest levers.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think there is a context why this meeting is happening today, and that is to answer one of the questions around engagement and industry involvement in our research, which is very much something that this particular meeting is focusing on out of the Sustainable Buildings project. In that project, there is exactly that type of demonstrator project, and Ben's leading that. The idea of that is to build a building potentially, or a space where the university, back to the question, the university is developing that innovation, it's sharing that knowledge, but it's doing it together with industry. And in this way, things like the NCC, the National Construction Code, can be informed by this development and the outcomes and the results, rather than we've, top down the code, the policy is there, drives our thinking. We want to also be informing policy through the findings and the experimental work. So experimenting, I think, is a very important activity that the university can do.
Yeah, I'd love to give a perspective in relation to housing policy, because I think it really illustrates the big challenges that face any of us who are trying to put forward policy change in this space. And that is that policy change, which probably in the territory that we're talking about means regulation, certainly with the National Construction Code. It's not just a matter of having the evidence of what's going to improve the, what's going to take us to net zero emission housing. It's also addressing the other bundle of concerns that governments and that industry, quite frankly, will also raise. And that is, for instance, the trade-off between affordability and speed. And so, as Hudson says, anything that might slow down the rollout of housing, putting aside the fact that producers deliberately slow down the rollout of housing to maximise their profits. But in a political sense, anything that might be seen to either slow things down, make things more complicated, and or add to the actual capital cost of construction will always be resisted, as will things that don't even do that. And that's the best example there is the former planning minister's attempt to require pale roofs in Western Sydney, which was just shot down, as I don't know how, requiring light roofing material would make housing more expensive. But I think us in the university sector, we're independent. We have a real role and an obligation to challenge the myths, essentially, that pop up in public discourse about the trade-off between, for instance, housing affordability and housing sustainability.
Yeah, look, great discussion, and we could go on in that discussion, but there is another question that picks up on an earlier comment, which is, what does industry require from our new graduates to thrive in this sustainable construction industry, which we alluded to earlier, but anyone want to have a go at that? What type of skills, what's missing if we really want to drive this net zero emission building industry in the future in terms of our graduates? Ali, do you have a thought there? Anyone?
Yeah,
yep.
I guess I can start, but it's also probably more relevant for industry to tell us what we need to be aligning our courses and offerings, teaching offerings. So I think one of those areas is sustainability and that focus on circular economy. And essentially, I'm seeing a lot of drive and continued siloed thinking in the teaching, in the training, and that is around energy. It's all energy, energy, energy. But we have to remember in the construction sector, materials is a very important component in the buildings and urban design of buildings and so on. So how do we think about this nexus between energy and materials? How do we consider that in our teaching? Is it all about energy? Or is there something more important? Is the energy being used to prepare the materials for the construction? Where are all those material resources? We talk about energy efficiency a lot, and that's very important because a lot of the mitigation for climate change, for net zero targets will be achieved through energy efficiency, but there is a material use efficiency question also. So I think around materials, around how we source those materials sustainably, the supply chains, and the circular nature of that material use, the end of life is another area I think we don't discuss much. So that's also very important for us to begin to address that and think about how we train future generations to deal with the design question up front for end of use, end of life at the end of the life of the whole of life.
Do you think that's missing from the curriculum at the moment? That's not.
Well, I think it is. I think we talk about sustainability generally. Again, energy is and materials and therefore waste continues to be the poor cousin of energy.
Yep.
So we've got to come back a little bit to the drawing board and reflect on that energy materials nexus a little bit more.
Yep.
It's not just about energy. Yep. We know a lot about energy. We teach that very well, but we need to consider how, for example, any new innovation or technology that we train our students in, we need to consider where those materials have come from to make and design and build that technology.
Good one.
And how sustainable that new technology really is. There's a lot of greenwashing in technologies. We need to be very clear about how sustainable particular innovations really are and teach that.
Yep, good answer, good one, really interesting. We have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to move along. Someone has said, all right, so what about the University of Sydney campus? It set itself some goals. It's apparently signing up to GBCA targets. This is a question directed at Gillian, obviously. Give us a quick summary of what's happening at the University of Sydney.
Where to start? 2020, the sustainability strategy was launched. So there has been some fantastic work that has happened over the last couple of years to a backdrop of COVID, of course, which has presented limitations. Essentially, we've got a range of challenges that we're addressing across 16 different strategic areas. The challenge of energy and emissions is obviously key to our approach. We are essentially these targets are organised across 3 pillars, and I think this is really important because it's what differentiates Sydney in comparison to some of the other universities locally and interstate. And that is that we're also focusing on embedding sustainability into in a a strategic way into our education and research. And, you know, obviously we've been hearing all afternoon about the amazing work that's happening in this space, but what the strategy seeks to do is, I guess, put some coordination around that and, you know, and provide some really new and interesting opportunities to further it. I'll give you a couple of examples. I've probably got just a short amount of time left, but one of the initiatives that we're progressing is the Living Labs piece, and you know, essentially that's an opportunity for students to collaborate with researchers and with our operational professionals on campus to identify some of the you know, the technologies and ideas that are emerging that could be piloted in an on-campus sense. And you know, obviously we've got some really good examples. Ali, we've got the green cement and the gel iron smart benches, etc., that are already being essentially living labs on campus. But we're going to be offering seed funding through the sustainability strategy to be able to broaden that. And there are lots of opportunities in the net zero space, and particularly in relation to campus operations, to be able to progress that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that as of next year, the university is launching a sustainability major. And so that will be as of first semester next year. So that, you know, again, multidisciplinary, I guess drawing on some of what you were talking about just now, Ali, in terms of the need for us to I guess harness all of those different specialties and expertise that we've got across the university, and to work with industry, to work with government to understand, you know, where and how we need to train our graduates. So it's really exciting. It's a starting point, and yeah, there'll be more to come in that space.
I'm very interested in learning more about that sustainability, mate. That's fascinating news to me, but very exciting. I can see there are questions coming through the Zoom. I hope the virtual audience knows to use, because it's not showing up on my little iPad, but I can ask, there's a question from the audience here. Ron?
Yes. Thank you. We've just picking up the point on waste. We've just gone through a number of natural disasters which generated enormous amounts of waste. I mean, on television, you see people tossing out the entire contents of their houses. I'm just wondering what impact that has on our ability to reach zero, or net zero, as it were.
What do natural disasters have?
Well, no, the impact on people having to throw out everything.
Yeah.
Because we have to remember that the amount of stuff that gets recycled is actually very small. Most of it just goes into landfill.
Yeah, I might take that as a comment because I'm not sure. Does anyone want to have a go at that?
I can just make a really brief comment, not necessarily in the context of my current role, but I've come from 20 years in government, and most recently leading resilience and recovery programs for the New South Wales EPA in the waste space. So I guess a comment like that resonates because these are you know, still emerging challenges. We've got in New South Wales an entire agency built around, you know, the question of resilience and how we support communities in the context of natural disaster and the increasing impacts of climate change and how that translates to waste. No easy solutions. I don't have an answer necessarily, but I guess I just wanted to reiterate that you know, that this is also an area that I know there is some interest here at the university in. I've been talking to David Schlossberg, who is the director of...
Yep, who should be here, otherwise he's at a workshop, he would be here.
Right. And David has, you know, some particular interests in this space, as do other researchers. So, yeah, I think some good work and thinking still needed.
Yeah, and Sydney and Nana works closely with David at SEI as appropriate. We are coming to the end of the time, and I want to allow for a brief reception afterwards. I'll go ahead, Jeff.
Sure. I was just going to make a comment on that one. I think Gillian kind of beat me to it. It was around resilience. And it was last week I was speaking to someone from GPT again, and they were talking about one of the shopping centers that they had right on the Brisbane River. And 10 years ago, after the floods they said, well, let's make sure that this is designed and built to be as resilient as possible. In the event, it's probably never going to happen, we get a massive flood, because how can it happen again? We'll just to make sure, we'll build this up. And it is unbelievable. The flood mitigation and these walls that came up. And it's hard to believe that a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago at least, the entire area was completely flooded, and pretty much all of their neighbors up and down the river were completely washed out. Their barriers held tight. And literally the day after the floodwaters went down, they put barriers down and they were back in operation. And I think it speaks to the significance around the reduction of waste that we know is going to happen if we don't respond to this in the same way. So we are seeing activity happening. I don't think that waste is probably it's a very big issue. I don't want to water it down. It's a huge issue. But if we're not thinking about long-term resilience in our built environment, then we're going to be stuck at the same point, like a loop that's skipping on a record that we can't seem to get off of.
Nice play on words, Jeff. Water it down. But we have one last question. So someone has said this is all good, but how do we ensure this transition takes place without increasing costs to end users? Who wants to have a go at that question? Well, Hudson, yes.
So in the commercial and infrastructure building, which is the big end of construction and infrastructure is where MECLA is focused. And yes, if you go to one of the cement providers and ask for a low emission mix, I'm told there's a 2 to 3% extra margin. Premium. But sorry, not margin, premium.
Yep.
But relative to the total project cost, that's very small. And relative to the cost of not doing it, we'd argue that it's very much worthwhile. The challenge at the residential level is that is such a price-sensitive market. And as I've said, any change in the short term can increase cost. But I think we can also show that once change is understood by the market, they can deliver it for a very similar price. Once a process is understood and training is done and that process has changed, then it becomes the new norm and becomes the standard price. So yes, there's a risk in the short term, but I think in the long term, where scale from production comes in, I think that comes out in the wash.
Good answer. Thanks.
Could we just also add that it's actually operational savings to the consumer, particularly in the residential sector. So the resident will benefit from the changes. It's the upfront costs incurred by
and
the
that split
building owner.
That split incentive is where the market fails, because the builder doesn't want to be charging the extra price because they're unable to sell the benefits sufficiently, and the customer doesn't understand those benefits to see the ongoing operational. And so where you see assets that are owned in the long term, retirement living or a university campus or a school or a hospital, it makes sense to invest in maybe a more expensive build, knowing that CapEx results in reduced OpEx.
Yep. Great stuff. I mean, we've got to get this message out there, don't we? This is really important. We've got a question from the front row.
It's really picking up on the last two comments. So this idea of afford to buy and afford to run and bringing together the narrative of affordability. So it's much more nuanced. And so sometimes we innovate in technology and forget to innovate in the concepts of value we're bringing to the market. And so just in the comment around, when it hits the market and where that value proposition for the builder, the value proposition for the end user, and the idea that is the university looking at sort of how to engage and what is the values conversation and what is the value already in the market and how to catalyse that? Because I've found that to be just as innovative, but perhaps not as technology focused. And I love the idea of a dictionary that you're working on. So identifying that importance of value and meaning. And, so sometimes as academics and industry, we get caught up on the thing and not what it means to the market. And both research and industry are answerable to the market. And that's the catalyzing in the market is where the excitement is going to happen.
Good question. Good comment. Thank you, Nicole.
Let me just share the irony. And that is actually in housing, things that make housing more expensive are also more valuable. That's a great irony, is that when the price of housing goes up, actually so does demand. And the research evidence is that climate, these types of products, so net zero emission housing is actually more valued by the market. That also becomes the affordability rub, less about market desire or market feasibility and more about a social equity concern at the end of the day. Mm. Yeah.
I think it's much complex beyond that, because we talk about net zero targets and wanting to align with SDG and achieving targets by 2030, 2050. But then there's the affordability, the social questions. There's a business question around circular economy. How do we, circular business models, how do we design them so that, for the building sector, like other sectors, how do we design them here where there is shared costs, for example, or policies that drive, or affect affordability? For example, if you are selling a house, there could be policy where you must show the energy efficiency of that house during the sale. Those types of top-down policies and rules that we currently don't have, or the energy ratings where they are only recommended rather than mandatory, for example, in the affordability of rentals. It gets more complex there because, renovating for a rental property, the landlord doesn't want to do or expend that cost. But, then it becomes quite complex because the trade-offs are very classical.
I would also add that the finance sector has a big role to play.
That's right.
And we know the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework, is bearing down on lenders, particularly institutional investors, but also lenders. And I recently wrote a paper for the Sustainable Homes team in the Office of Energy and Climate Change, the old DPIE. And the ability of a valuer to appreciate, on paper, black and white, to evaluate the value of solar, better insulation, double glazing, draft proofing, and so on, compared to a bog standard house next door. If there's a fire sale, they value them the same. Well, that's only one way of valuing it. If valuing it in terms of the default risk of the occupant who is paying the mortgage, and they have significantly lower energy costs and upkeep costs, then they're a lower risk to lend to. So maybe lending them the extra $20,000 so they can have a 7-star home instead of a 6-star home, or an 8-star home instead of a 7-star home, that starts to bring value to the bank and lower the bad debts book to the bank. And that's another way of funding this, because the marginal difference between, adding $20,000 to a mortgage over 30 years is very little. But at the moment, the way it's seen is for the new first home buyer, they just can't get into the market. And that extra $20,000 is just $20,000 too much.
And just to not to put too fine a point on this last one, is that when we launched the Green Star Homes a couple of months ago, or I guess it was late last year, Commonwealth Bank has already jumped on board, and they're doing exactly this. And they put out Australia's first low mortgage sustainable home interest rate. It's a 1.99%, I think it is now. It's something like 2.8% less than what their base rate is. So this is definitely happening. And to Hudson's point, like, it's exactly right for them. They're saying, we're going to be the majority shareholder of this home for a long time. We want to make sure this thing is energy efficient, it's resilient, it's going to maintain a long time. So let's invest in that. And then the purchaser also gets the upside of that with a low interest rate for the duration of the loan. So it's significant. And the last point on this is that, 3 or 4 years ago, like, we weren't even really having a conversation about net zero anything. And it's amazing how fast the momentum has picked up. And there's so much interest and so much action happening here. So I think we're in a very good spot. And I think it's only going to continue to snowball and get bigger and bigger. And it probably is off the backdrop of all this death and destruction, and the planet's on fire, or flooding, or drought, or a combination of all three. But we're getting there. And collectively, I think it's a good sign for what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, great comment, Jeff. I can see Gillian had.
Look, it was just a brief comment, and that was that none of these considerations exist in isolation of behaviour change and education, which I think kind of sits alongside, but as part of the work that we're doing at the university, I think and embedding and that. I guess that works for the sustainability strategy as well as more broadly, but embedding those kind of multidisciplinary concepts of behaviour change, education and engagement is part of the answer as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Look, that's a lovely note to end on. And I'm conscious of time, and there is something here to drink. I look at the audience. Any final remarks? Anyone like to say anything very briefly? Otherwise, I'm going to thank the panel, in particular, Hudson, Jeff. Jeff, I hope you're well. I hope you recover soon. You did a great job. Really appreciate your time. Hudson, great to meet you and hope that we can build on this engagement. I did want to ask MECLA, who pays your salary? That was my question. Where does the money come from?
So the first 2 years were funded by New South Wales government.
That's right, okay.
And a hell of a lot of sweat equity from and work in kind.
Yes.
To say that. We're now moving into...
Fair enough. Very good. Fair enough. Thank you, Nicole. Wonderful to meet you. Thank you, Ali. Brilliant as always. Thank you, Gillian. Great that you could be here. And to the AAAA. So Arianna, Ali, Arunima, Alex, fabulous. Really, that was a great session. It's the beginning of the conversation. It's not the beginning of the conversation. It's a step forward in the conversation. Well done. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the City Nano team, Claire, Moen, Trudy, the whole gang who've been in the background making this happen. Fantastic. And on that note, I'll wrap up. Stay around, have something to drink. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've got to get